Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life? Like her gaze, which you mistook for love, was just a reflection of her own fantasy? With every minute of this video, your awareness will grow like a spark catching fire, burning away the lies. We'll expose how you became a puppet to her unconscious, and trust me, later you'll uncover a jaw dropping truth about the dark side of a woman's psyche that'll flip your world upside down. Don't look away. This is your shot to wake up. Stick around to the end if you're ready to see the real you. He stood in a crowded room, but her gaze singled him out. Her eyes, deep and magnetic, seemed to promise they could unravel his core, see what he'd long kept hidden. This was the moment he'd later call the start of his downfall, or maybe his awakening. The man, whose name no longer mattered as he teetered on the edge of becoming a character in someone else's play, felt the warmth of her attention. It wrapped around him like a soft glow, but that warmth hid a trap. She didn't see him, the real him, with all his flaws, doubts, and clumsy attempts to be someone who mattered. She saw a projection, an ideal her unconscious had sculpted from childhood dreams, old stories, and unspoken desires. Blinded by her gaze, he mistook it for love. That night, he felt alive in a way he hadn't before. His steps grew bolder, his voice steadier, his smile more daring. He didn't notice how his actions started bending to fit her expectations, how his words echoed what he thought she wanted to hear instead of his own truth. He became an actor, unaware of the script, guided only by her gaze, which he wrongly took for acceptance. Every move she made, every fleeting gesture, he read as a signal, proof he'd finally been chosen. But it wasn't him who was chosen, it was the image she'd cast him in. The animus, as Jung would call it, her inner masculine ideal, was seeking a vessel, and he, without realizing it, agreed to play the part. He didn't see how his soul was fading in this charade. His dreams, fears, and true desires slipped into the background, giving way to the role he played with growing conviction. He wanted to be her hero, her savior, the one to fill the void in her eyes. But that void wasn't his to fill. It belonged to her unconscious shadows, to her animus, which set the rules of the game. In his craving to be loved, he didn't notice he was losing himself. His laugh grew a bit too loud, his gestures too calculated. He didn't see his authenticity unraveling in this performance, how he became a canvas for her to paint on. That was his first mistake. He believed her gaze was a mirror, not a spotlight. Each night after that meeting, he came home riding a high, but deep down a flicker of unease stirred. It was subtle, like a shadow darting across a room. He brushed it off, drowning out the inner voice with more meetings, more moments when her eyes found him again. He didn't know those moments weren't about him, but about her fantasy, her need to see in him what she'd always sought. He didn't know the love he felt wasn't a bond between souls, but an illusion woven from her projections and his fear of going unseen. So began his journey, a path that would lead to unmasking pain and, just maybe, to himself. You're still here? That means there's a spark in you, hungry for truth. Want to find out how deep you're caught in her illusions? Stick around. The next part will show you how you lost yourself without even noticing. Don't bail now if you're ready to face your reflection without the mask. Their relationship picked up speed, like a river flowing down a set course, but beneath the surface, currents swirled that he didn't see. Still drunk on her gaze, the man sank deeper into the illusion they both called love. Every morning he woke up thinking of her. Every night he fell asleep, replaying her gestures, her laugh, her fleeting touches. He didn't see that these moments weren't about him, but about the role he played with increasing devotion. His life began to orbit around her, like a satellite around a distant star, and he didn't notice how his own path was narrowing. He started changing himself almost without realizing it. Habits that once felt like part of who he was faded into the background. He saw less of his friends, whose crude jokes and raw talks now seemed rough compared to her refinement. Hobbies he used to take pride in gathered dust, replaced by her wishes. He dressed the way he thought she'd like, spoke to spark her smile, and stayed silent when he sensed his words might upset their delicate balance. He didn't see his authenticity slipping away in his drive to please, how he was becoming a shadow of himself, molding himself to her unconscious expectations. Meanwhile, she kept seeing not him, but a projection of her animus, her inner masculine ideal, woven from childhood daydreams, old tales, and buried fears, dictated what he should be. She sought a hero, a savior, someone to fill the emptiness in her soul, but that emptiness was hers alone, and he, unaware, tried to be its answer. Her attention swung between warm and cold as if she were constantly testing how well he fit her fantasy. When he met her expectations, she rewarded him with warmth that sent his heart racing. When he strayed from the role, she grew distant, and sensing the shift, he doubled down to win back her favor. Their meetings were a dance, but not one of harmony. It was a dance of shadows, where each saw in the other not a real person, but a reflection of their own projections. He soaked up her attention, mistaking it for closeness, but didn't see it turning into his addiction. Her praise became his fuel, her gaze his reward, her presence proof of his worth. He didn't realize this dependence wasn't on her, but on the image she cast onto him. He thought he was at the center of their bond, but in truth he was circling her, losing himself with every step. Deep down, he sensed something was off. Sometimes, in the quiet of late nights when her image faded, a vague unease crept in. It was faint, like the rustle of leaves outside, but it grew. He pushed it aside, silencing the inner voice with more meetings, more attempts to earn her love. He didn't want to see that his efforts weren't for her, but for an illusion he was upholding. His fear of going unnoticed, his desperate need to feel valued, kept him dancing even as his legs grew weary. She, for her part, didn't realize her love was aimed not at him, but at her animus. Her unconscious sought an embodiment of her ideal, and his willingness to adapt made him seem perfect for the role. But her coldness, her sudden mood swings, weren't just whims, it was her animus, demanding the impossible. She didn't see his pain, his sacrifices, his efforts to become someone he wasn't. She saw only how well he matched her fantasy, and when he fell short, she pulled back, leaving him in the void. So they danced on, blind to how their dance was becoming a theater of illusions. He was the actor, she the director, but neither knew the script. Their connection, which felt so alive, rested on the shaky ground of projections, and that ground was starting to crack. He didn't feel his soul straining under the weight of his mask, didn't hear the faint but persistent inner voice whispering that he was losing himself. He didn't see that this dance wasn't leading to love, but to an inevitable break, with her, with the illusion, and maybe with himself. Can you feel your world starting to shift? This isn't the end, it's the start. Want to know what's behind her coldness, behind your pain? Stay with us, because the next chapter will shatter the mirror of illusions. Only the brave keep going. The illusion he'd so carefully built began to crumble, like a sandcastle swept away by the tide. Clinging to the idea of their love, the man didn't at first notice how her gaze had changed. Her eyes, once warm and inviting, now slid past him, as if searching for something beyond him, something he couldn't offer. She grew distant, her smiles rarer, her touches cooler. He felt the ground slipping beneath him but couldn't figure out why. He kept playing his role, still trying to be the hero he thought she wanted, but the script, which he'd never known, had shifted. She no longer cheered his efforts, and her silence tore him apart. It started with small things. She stopped replying to his texts with the same warmth. Her voice lost the softness that once set his heart racing. He noticed her looking away when he tried to meet her eyes. her attention drifting. When he shared his dreams, he felt her slipping away but couldn't pinpoint what he'd done wrong. He doubled down, planning surprises, being more attentive, giving up his time to please her. But the harder he tried, the further she drifted. Her coldness was like a mirror, reflecting not her but his own vulnerability, his reliance on her approval. That mirror began to crack, and in those cracks, he glimpsed not her fantasy but his own delusion. He didn't know her distance wasn't about him. She never saw the real him she never had. Her animus, the inner masculine ideal she unconsciously projected onto him, demanded perfection he couldn't deliver. When he failed to fit that role, her unconscious rejected him like an actor miscast in a play. She didn't lash out or blame him. She simply lost interest because he no longer matched the man she'd imagined. Her love, if it was love at all, was fragile as glass, and now that glass had shattered, leaving him among the shards. The pain built slowly but relentlessly. He felt betrayed, abandoned, yet couldn't muster anger. Instead, confusion mixed with guilt consumed him. He picked apart their relationship, replaying every moment, every word, every gesture, desperate to find his mistake. He didn't see that the mistake wasn't his, but in the very nature of their bond, built on illusions. He blamed himself for not being good enough, for not being the hero she sought. His self-worth, already eroded by months of bending to her expectations, started to collapse. He felt hollow, like a shell emptied of its core. But in that pain, something new stirred. In moments of solitude, sitting in the dark of his apartment, staring at his silent phone, questions he'd avoided began to surface. Why did he need her approval so badly? Why did her coldness feel like the end of the world? Why did he feel worthless without her gaze? These questions were like sparks breaking through the ashes of his broken heart. He began to see how much he'd given up to be loved, how much he'd lost to fit her fantasy. He recalled moments when he silenced his desires, stayed quiet when he wanted to speak, smiled when he wanted to scream. He realized he'd betrayed not just her expectations, but himself. This realization hurt, but set him free. He saw that his role in their relationship wasn't strength, but an escape from weakness. He played the hero, not because he was one, but because he feared being nothing. His drive to please, his willingness to sacrifice himself, wasn't love but fear of going unseen, of loneliness, of rejection. He understood that his love for her was less about her and more about his need to feel significant. This hit like a punch, but it was also his first step toward waking up. He looked at their old photos, at her smile that now seemed like a mask, and for the first time didn't want to turn back time. He started asking questions not about her, but about himself. Who was he before he met her? What did he love, dream of, fear? These questions scared him because he didn't have answers. He felt like a man who'd lost the map to his soul, but recognizing that loss was the start of his journey. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in ages, he felt the urge to keep going. Her distance, her exit from his life, marked not just the end of an illusion, but the beginning of his return to himself. He couldn't see it clearly yet, but deep down, beneath the pain and confusion, a spark was growing, a spark that would later become a fire, burning away the masks he wore. The crack in the mirror he looked into wasn't destruction, but opportunity, an opportunity to see not her fantasies, but the truth about himself, a truth he'd dodged for too long. Can you see the cracks in your own story? This isn't weakness, it's your chance. Want to find out how solitude becomes your greatest teacher? Stay with us because the next chapter will show you how darkness gives birth to light. Don't back down if you're ready for the truth. Her leaving left a void that felt vast, like a starless night sky. The man, whose life had once revolved around her gaze, now faced a loneliness that wasn't just the absence of company, but a state of being. His apartment, once alive with the warmth of their moments, became a silent witness to his inner collapse. He wandered through rooms where every corner held memories of her, but those memories no longer comforted. They stung. Her coldness, her distance, her final departure shattered the illusion he'd so carefully nurtured, and now he stood amid the wreckage of what he thought was love. But in this emptiness, in this silence, something new was taking root, a glimmer of truth he couldn't yet name or embrace. The first days after the breakup were agony. He felt like a ship adrift, anchorless in a stormy sea with no landmarks. His routines, his goals, his joys, all were tied to her presence, to her approval. Without her, he didn't know who he was. He got up each morning but saw no point in moving forward. He looked in the mirror but didn't recognize the man staring back. His face, his eyes, his slumped shoulders felt foreign, as if he'd worn a mask his whole life, and now with it gone, he didn't know what lay beneath. This emptiness terrified him, but he couldn't escape it. It was everywhere, in the silence of his apartment, the stillness of his phone, the solitude of his thoughts. He tried to fill the void. At first, he threw himself into work, hoping the hustle would drown out the pain. He took on extra projects, stayed late at the office, but work didn't help. It only highlighted his inner disarray. Then he reached out to old friends, but their loud chatter and jokes felt hollow, like echoes in an empty house. He tried new connections, but every new glance, every new smile reminded him of her, of how he'd once bought into an illusion. Everything he did only deepened his loneliness because he was searching for salvation outside himself, not realizing the key was within. One evening, sitting in the dark with a glass of wine, he let himself stop. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't check his phone, didn't try to silence the quiet. He just sat, staring into the void, and listened. At first, the silence was deafening, almost unbearable. It pressed on him like a heavy weight, forcing him to feel the full force of his pain, his losses, his mistakes. But then, in that silence, he began to hear something else, a faint, barely audible voice that had always been there, but that he'd ignored for so long. This voice offered no comfort, no promises of rescue. It simply asked, "Who are you without her? What do you love? What do you fear?" These questions cut like a blade through the fabric of his familiar life. But in that cut, he began to see light. He started noticing the masks he'd worn. He recalled how he'd tailored himself to her expectations, how he'd buried his desires to be the man she wanted. He saw how his laugh had grown too loud, his words chosen to suit her reactions, his dreams pushed aside to avoid disrupting her script. He realized his love wasn't about her, but about his need to be seen, to be needed, to be someone. He saw how his fear of loneliness, of rejection, had driven him to play a role that was never his. That role had earned him the fleeting warmth of her gaze, but cost him something far more precious, himself. Loneliness became not just pain, but a mirror. In it, he saw not only his loss, but his responsibility. He understood that she hadn't betrayed him. He'd betrayed himself by agreeing to be someone he wasn't. He'd let her projections, her animus, dictate who he should be, and that was his weakness. But it was also his strength, because recognizing this weakness was his first step toward overcoming it. He began asking questions not about her, but about himself. What did he want before he met her? What parts of himself had he buried to be loved? These questions scared him because the answers demanded courage he didn't yet feel. He spent more time alone, not as punishment, but as exploration. He walked the city at night, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic, finding something soothing in the rhythm. He started writing in an old notebook he found in a drawer, jotting down thoughts that came in the quiet. These notes were messy, full of pain and doubt, but truth shone through. He wrote about his fear of being nothing, his longing to be seen, his ache for something greater than the fleeting warmth of another's gaze. These words were like threads he began weaving to stitch himself back together. In the silence of his loneliness, he began to see not only his own masks, but hers. He realized her love, her gaze, her promises weren't about him, but about her own inner drama. She wasn't seeking him, but an embodiment of her animus, and when he couldn't be that, she left. This didn't spark anger, but compassion. He saw she was as trapped by her illusions, her unconscious projections, as he was. She wasn't the villain in his story. She was a person as lost as he was. This silence wasn't an end, but a beginning. It was painful, but vital, like a surgical cut that removes the disease to make way for the healthy. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he felt he couldn't go back. Loneliness stopped being his enemy. It became his teacher. In it, he found not just pain, but strength, not just emptiness, but possibility. He wasn't ready to call it an awakening, but deep down beneath the veil of pain, he felt himself starting to return to who he was. You're standing on the edge of a revelation. Want to uncover the dark secret that drives her heart? Stay with us. The next chapter will expose the chilling power of her animus. It'll change everything. Don't walk away if you want to be free. Solitude, once a bottomless abyss to him, became a sanctuary and a crucible where his soul was forged anew. He no longer fled the silence, but dove into it like plunging into dark waters, knowing truth lay at the bottom. The pain of their breakup lingered, but it was no longer just a wound. It was a compass guiding him back to himself. In this silence, he saw not only his own mask, but her illusions, and this insight led him to a brutal truth that upended his understanding of their relationship and the nature of a woman's love. He faced the animus, the dark, manipulative force buried in her unconscious. And this encounter was the pivotal moment of his awakening. He sat in his apartment, surrounded by dim light with an open notebook where his once chaotic thoughts were taking shape. He wrote about her, not with longing, but with curiosity, trying to understand why her love, which felt so real, proved so fragile. He recalled her gaze, her mood swings, her sudden coldness, and for the first time didn't blame himself. He began to suspect her distance wasn't his failure, but a sign of something deeper, something unrelated to him. He read Jung, whose words about the female animus, the inner masculine image, struck a chord. The animus, Jung wrote, could be a hero or a tyrant, but when unconscious, it became a destructive force, projecting unattainable ideals onto a man and punishing him for falling short. This idea hit him hard. He realized she didn't love him. She loved the image her animus had cast onto him. Her gaze, which he'd taken for acceptance, wasn't about him, but about her fantasy. A hero, a savior, the perfect man she'd sought since childhood. When he couldn't embody that image, her animus rejected him, and she unknowingly followed its command. Her coldness, her departure, weren't personal betrayal. It was the mechanics of her unconscious chasing perfection while dismissing human flaws. He saw her animus in the details, her demands, her sudden criticisms, her ability to shift from warmth to icy indifference without reason. It wasn't her. It was the dark side of her psyche, pulling her strings. This truth was harsh, almost unbearable. He felt cheated, not by her, but by the nature of their connection. He saw her love wasn't a gift, but a transaction, where he had to play a role to earn her attention. Her animus, like an unseen judge, constantly sized him up, and when he didn't measure up, she turned away, leaving him in the void. He recalled moments when he tried to please her, bearing his desires, fears, and doubts to be the man she wanted. He saw now how her animus fed on his weakness, his readiness to sacrifice himself. It wasn't love, it was manipulation, unconscious, but no less crushing. But in that pain, he found freedom. He realized she wasn't to blame. She was as much a prisoner of her animus as he was of her illusions. She didn't know her love was a mirage, that her demands were about her inner drama, not him. He felt compassion for her, not the kind that pulls you back into dependence, but the kind that lets you let go. He began to see her not as a goddess or a foe, but as a person wrestling her own shadows. This clarity gave him the strength to turn inward to his own path. He began the process of individuation Jung described, a grueling but necessary journey to wholeness. He dug into his shadows, confronting the parts of himself he had suppressed to feel accepted. He recalled moments when he shied away from saying no, stayed silent to avoid conflict, or smiled to hide his pain. He saw how his fear of loneliness, his need for approval, made him vulnerable to her projections. He started integrating his anima, his inner femininity, sensibility, intuition, vulnerability, he'd long rejected as weakness. He realized he'd sought in her not a partner, but a piece of himself he was too scared to own. This process was painful, like purification by fire. He spent hours alone, reflecting, writing, facing hard truths. He felt his old self, the one that lived for others' approval, dying. It wasn't a physical death, but a symbolic one, no less terrifying. He feared that without his role, without the mask, he'd be nothing. But in that emptiness, he found something new, a core that didn't rely on outside validation. He began to feel steadier, not as an actor playing strength, but as a man who knew who he was, even in silence. He noticed the world reacting to his change. Friends used to his compliance now looked at him with surprise when he said no or stood his ground. Colleagues who saw him as reliable but predictable began respecting his newfound resolve. Most importantly, he respected himself. He no longer sought her reflection in the mirror. He saw a man who'd survived an illusion, faced a truth, and chose to keep going. This chapter wasn't about victory, but about starting anew. He wasn't whole yet, but he was on his way. The brutal truth about the animus freed him from its grip, but it also showed him his own responsibility. He couldn't blame her for her projections if he'd let them shape him. He saw his strength wasn't in being loved, but in being himself, even if it meant standing alone. This truth, like fire, burned away his old illusions. But in that fire, he began to find himself, not a puppet, not an actor, but a man ready to write his own story. You've seen the darkness in her soul and your own. Want to learn how to become the one who shapes your destiny. Stay until the end, because the final chapter will show you the path to authenticity. This is your last chance to wake up. The man, once lost in a maze of others' projections, now stood on firm ground, forged in the crucible of solitude and self-discovery. The path of individuation, fraught with pain and revelations, had brought him to a place where he no longer sought himself in others' eyes. He'd walked through fire, burned away the masks he wore, and embraced the shadows he'd long denied. The harsh reality of the animus, the dark side of her unconscious, had unshackled him from love's illusions, but more crucially, it revealed his own role in the drama. Now he was no longer an actor. He was the author of his life, and this freedom changed everything, from how he saw the world to how the world saw him. His days no longer began with a longing for her approval. Mornings greeted him with silence, but this silence was no longer emptiness. It was a space where he could hear himself. He rose, brewed coffee, and gazed out at the city. Feeling his place in the world didn't depend on anyone's gaze. He was no longer a satellite orbiting someone else's star. He'd become his own center, a force around which his life took shape. His movements carried a calm certainty, his voice a quiet strength that didn't need to shout. He didn't strive to prove his worth. He knew it, and that was enough. The journey of individuation had marked him like scars on a warrior back from battle. He'd integrated his anima, his inner femininity, owning the sensitivity, intuition, and vulnerability he'd once dismissed as weakness. He no longer sought in women the parts of himself he feared to face. He accepted his shadow, anger, fear, insecurity, and instead of hiding them, saw them as strength. These inner struggles made him whole, not perfect, but real. He didn't shy away from his contradictions, for in them lay his humanity. His everyday life shifted, though not on the surface. He still went to work, hung out with friends, paid bills, but now with a presence he'd never known. He noticed the little things: sunlight filtering through leaves, a stranger's laughter, the smell of rain. These moments, once overlooked, now brought him subtle joy, because he no longer saw the world through her expectations. He saw it as it was and himself in it, not as a character in someone else's story, but as a man choosing his own way. His relationships with others transformed too. Friends, used to his people-pleasing ways, now sensed a new strength. They noticed how he set boundaries, said no without guilt, listened without losing himself. Some drifted away, unsettled by his change, but he didn't chase them. He knew authenticity repelled those who craved masks and drew in those who valued truth. Most, he respected himself more. His colleagues, who once saw him as just dependable, now admired his clarity and grit. He wasn't just nice anymore, he was real, and that made him both inspiring and intimidating. But the deepest change was in how he approached love. He no longer saw it as salvation or a way to fill a void. He knew love born of need was not love, but dependency. He didn't fall for projections, didn't seek goddesses or rescuers in women. He saw them as they were, people with their own shadows, fears, and dreams. This clarity let him enter relationships with newfound freedom. He didn't fear rejection. His worth wasn't tied to someone's approval. He didn't fear losing himself in love because he knew how to love without losing himself. One day, he met a woman whose gaze didn't promise salvation, but offered connection. She didn't seek a hero in him or project her fantasies onto him. Her eyes were clear, free of the hunger he'd once mistaken for love. She stood before him, authentic, unapologetic about her flaws, and he felt he could finally be himself. Their bond wasn't a stage play or a game of projections. It was a meeting of two people who'd done their inner work, who knew who they were, and chose each other not out of need, but freedom. She didn't demand roles from him or seek him to fix her inner turmoil. She was his partner, his ally, not a prize or a dream. This connection confirmed he was on the right path, but he knew his freedom didn't hinge on her. He was enough without her, and that made their relationship even more precious. He didn't fear losing her because no loss could take him from himself. He'd learned to love, not out of fear of losing control or of losing himself. This love, as Jung said, was rare and risky, born not from need but from wholeness. It demanded nothing yet offered everything. The world around him reacted to his mystique with a blend of awe and unease. People used to his predictability felt off balance by his presence. His quiet strength threw them off. Some called him aloof, too intense, but he knew their words mirrored their own fears. He'd become a mirror reflecting others' masks back at them, and not everyone was ready for that. Women still caught up in their animus accused him of being emotionally distant, but he saw their frustration as their inability to sway him. He was no longer a puppet in their fantasies, and that made him untouchable. He kept walking his path, never looking back. He wrote in his notebook, no longer just about pain, but about joy, strength, and what it meant to be alive. He found meaning in the simple things. Work that aligned with his values, friendships rooted in honesty, solitude that no longer scared him. Most he'd learned he didn't need applause to know his worth. His life wasn't flawless, but it was his, and that was his triumph. He often thought of her whose leaving had set this journey in motion. He felt no bitterness, no longing. She was a chapter in his story, a mirror that revealed his weaknesses and pushed him toward growth. He was grateful, not for her, but for the pain that brought him to himself, the love that never was, but for the love he found in himself. Evenings now he gazed at the stars, feeling his spirit, once torn, now breathing freely. He knew individuation was a lifelong road, with new voices, new battles ahead. He was ready. He didn't fear loneliness. It was his haven. He didn't fear love. He knew how to love without losing himself. He'd become not just alive, but present in every step, every thought, every choice. In this freedom to be, he'd found what he'd been chasing all along, himself. You're still here? Then you've chosen truth over illusion. Your awareness has grown with every minute, and now you see love isn't rescue. It's a mirror that can shatter but won't break you. You've faced the dark power of her animus and broken free from its hold. Now it's your move. Be the author of your life, not a character in someone else's script. Thanks for watching. Share your story in the comments. Your truth could light someone else's way. Subscribe to stay on this path. Wake up, man, and start living.